From cars.
48 Hours Investigates, Friday.
Biological weapons have come to be known as the poor man's nuclear bomb. Countries like Iraq and Libya, even groups like Al-Qaeda can make them easily and on the cheap. So if it's easy for leaders like Saddam or bin Laden to acquire these weapons of mass destruction, what about a simple private citizen like Dr. Larry Ford, a respected gynecologist from California who secretly kept germ warfare material in his home refrigerator? What's more, he worked closely with a notorious South African known as Dr. Death. But as we learned in this joint reporting effort with the New York Times, all this might never have come to light had it not been for what happened 2 years ago in Irvine, California. It started out as a local news story.
You're watching Southern California's CBS 2 News at 11.
Police believe that Dr. Ford was involved in the attempted hit of his business partner, James Riley.
Dr. Larry Ford hires a hitman to try to kill his business partner. The hit fails, and when police come to question Dr. Ford, he commits suicide. End of story? Well, not according to this man, Peter Fitzpatrick, who says he had evidence Larry Ford did more than just try to kill his business partner. He knew firsthand that Dr. Ford had been working with potentially lethal germs. And when he saw on television the local police walking around Dr. Ford's house unprotected, he called the authorities to warn them.
When the police were entering his property, it struck me that if the cop saw a jar and opened it up and smelled it, he doesn't know what he's smelling. And it could be fatal. It could be something which he would bring home to his family and release all of these dangerous germs, and all those germs would be blowing all over Southern California. I was worried.
How did he know? Back in 1986, Fitzpatrick was working as an undercover FBI informant at the South African attaché residence in Los Angeles. This was during the apartheid years. And one night there, he says he saw Dr. Ford pass a bag to a prominent South African military doctor, which the attaché told him was filled with deadly germs.
The goods were delivered.
The goods were delivered?
Yes.
What kind of germs?
Well, he was pretty specific. It was the cholera, typhoid, botulism, anthrax, bubonic plague.
Turns out Fitzpatrick wasn't the only one warning the authorities. According to Victor Bray, the head detective on the case.
We were receiving phone calls from different people all the time who had some contact with Dr. Ford.
And they were telling you?
They asked, did you dig up his backyard? And so we asked, why would we dig up the yard?
Why? Because Dr. Ford had buried tubes filled with guns, ammunition, and volatile C4 plastic explosives, which the authorities found when they finally did an excavation of the yard. And because of the warnings by Fitzpatrick and many others, the neighborhood was evacuated. And the FBI's weapons of mass destruction team responded in full protective gear. And what they found inside the house was a huge supply of potential germ warfare agents.
They checked the refrigerator in the garage and discovered 266 vials.
266 vials of what?
Cholera, salmonella. And there were many other things in there that weren't labeled specifically what they were.
So this was very dangerous, what he was doing.
Extremely dangerous.
To his neighbors.
Yes.
And he says it may have been not only the neighbors at risk, for hidden under a false floorboard in Dr. Ford's home and in his office, police found files on dozens of women, complete with medical notes, photos, and other personal details. Among the women, Shane Gregory, who had a brief relationship with Dr. Ford in the 80s. You had an affair, I take it.
I would say this would be an emotional affair. I had one episode of physical intimacy with him.
That's all.
That's it.
Shortly after the relationship ended, Miss Gregory came down with mysterious symptoms.
I wasn't able to work. I wasn't able to drive. I could barely walk. I saw 55 physicians between 1987 and 1991, at which time I had my first of 4 brain surgeries. And
First of 4 brain surgeries?
yes.
Surgeries for what several doctors had assumed was a rare neurological disorder. But many of the women in those files had similar debilitating and unexplained ailments. And when Detective Ray looked into Shane Gregory's case, he found evidence that Dr. Ford had been stalking her.
He had told other persons that we spoke with that he talked about infecting her with something. And then we later spoke to another informant who said that, in fact, Dr. Ford personally told him that he had done these things and that she would never be the same again.
Then he says there's Tammy Tippett, who barely knew Dr. Ford, but says that she became ill after meeting him at a business lunch.
I throw up blood. I have very odd lesions all over my body. I've had sores all up and down. I lose motor skills.
Watching her move her head and react to sound was like watching myself.
Really?
We both have severe hearing amplification. Severe.
And that was the point when I started to accept that maybe this is why I was sick.
Police handed the case over to health authorities who opened an investigation. All of this, the women, the suicide, and the attempted hit, came as a shock to Patrick Riley, the target of that hit. Riley was a partner in a small biotech company with Dr. Ford. Did you know of Larry Ford's interest in chemical and biological warfare or weapons?
Yes, but it never dawned on me that Larry was interested in finishing weapons. But he loved bugs. He loved that world.
Riley even testified at the trial of one of Dr. Ford's hired hitmen that Ford indicated he had worked for the U.S. Army, and after Ford's suicide, he found material in the office suggesting that Dr. Ford had a link to the CIA. So he was connected one way or another with the military establishment and the intelligence establishment, apparently, of the United States government.
I always just assumed it was the Army, but when you stop and think about it, as I have since then, certainly it was intelligence.
We'd been told, starting with Mr. Riley, and then by other witnesses, that Dr. Ford had some connection to the CIA, had some connection to the Army's germ warfare projects. We took it serious.
Did you ever find out if he did?
I can't say.
Neither would the FBI or the CIA tell us. But the Irvine police did find evidence that, as that FBI informant had said, Dr. Ford was working with a biowarfare program here in South Africa called Project Coast during the white-ruled apartheid years in the 80s and early 90s. Shortly after Dr. Ford's stockpile was discovered, U.S. intelligence contacted the South Africans, that is their seat of government here in Pretoria, and asked to speak with one of the scientists who had worked on their biological weapons program. And that scientist confirmed to them that Larry Ford did have a connection to South Africa's now dismantled chemical and biological warfare program. What's more, back in 1987, Dr. Ford had visited with scientists from this secret military installation outside Pretoria, according to South African prosecutor Tory Pretorius.
Larry Ford wanted to sell some of his stuff to South Africa.
Sell some of his
Stuff.
What stuff?
I don't know. That was never disclosed, what stuff he would have. And then there was a presentation at the military installation, the Intelligence College, and Larry Ford presented certain of his knowledge and know-how.
Know-how, for example, of how to wipe out an enemy military camp by lacing a pornographic magazine with deadly bacteria.
And because the book will go from soldier to soldier, and that's the best way to spread that kind of thing. And
in other words, you would spread
anthrax, for instance, you put anthrax on the
pages of
the pages, and then
of a pornographic magazine,
and then you ensure that it comes to a military camp, and every soldier in the camp would read it, and that way everybody would get infected with the bug.
An FBI informant in the United States by name Peter Fitzpatrick told us that he had seen Larry Ford pass a satchel of biological agents at the South African trade attache's home in Southern California. Why would he do that?
If some substance were needed by the South African program that weren't readily available, obviously they would use whatever contact they have, and they can say, please acquire this substance from Larry Ford.
And Dr. Ford's contact in South Africa was none other than the notorious leader of this secret biowarfare program, Brigadier Dr. Botha Basson, whom the press has dubbed Dr. Death. Prosecutors there brought charges against Basson for the murder of dozens of anti-apartheid activists. After Dr. Basson was arrested, South African authorities found this letter among his documents in which Besson asks his secret funds manager in Switzerland to set up an offshore account for a Dr. Larry Ford. Woodrow Besson, his stationery. There is an American scientist I sometimes work with that needs to deposit money in an offshore account. Swiss bank account. His name is Dr. Larry Ford.
What year was that?
This is 1991.
I was during the time I knew him. I was with him.
You never knew anything about it?
Absolutely nothing.
Riley says he and Ford were doing business at the time with a South African company called Delta G. Work on what Dr. Ford said was an anti-balding compound. But Delta G was in reality a front, a cover for Vaudebasson's secret chemical warfare research. And sources told us that Ford's anti-balding formula is remarkably similar to an assassination poison developed here for Basson, a poison called Silatrane.
I don't know what Silatrane is, so... The material that Larry had is similar to this material you just mentioned?
That's we are told.
Well, it's not the kind of thing he'd ever talk to me about.
He never did.
No. It's not the kind of thing he would have talked to me about. And it's hard to believe that he would be involved in that kind of a dastardly thing.
It would seem that perhaps Dr. Ford was using this project with you as a cover for the biological weapons work that he was doing. Did this never occur to you?
Never occurred to me.
Does it occur to you possibly now?
Sure.
What a strange story.
About as strange as it gets.
A Los Angeles gynecologist involved with a South African who ran the chemical and biological weapon program. What the dickens is this all about?
God, that's the $64,000 question. I wish I knew. I wish I knew.
So the question is, how did this American gynecologist with an apparent military and intelligence background, how did he get involved in South Africa's apartheid-era biowarfare program? And what, if anything, did the U.S. government know about it? We put those questions to one of the few people who could answer them, the notorious Walter Basson himself, who agreed to sit down with us for his first ever televised interview. When we return.
Betrayed his country and his family.
Let me see it!
Master Spy, the Robert Hansen story. CBS next Sunday.
The discovery of a biological stockpile in the home of that American gynecologist, Larry Ford, exposed his connection to South Africa's now dismantled biological warfare program called Project Coast that was created during South Africa's white-ruled apartheid era in the 1980s. For more than a decade, white scientists in South Africa created lethal chemicals and germs meant to kill blacks and other enemies of the apartheid regime. The mastermind behind that program was Dr. Walter Basson, who, like so many apartheid-era military officials, has escaped justice. But he is still known by his fellow South Africans as Dr. Death. The media have labeled you Dr. Death.
I wasn't sure why they were doing that because I knew of no earthly reason why they should do that.
Why? According to this U.S. Air Force Academy report co-authored by Professor Helen Perkett, Dr. Walter Basson ran one of the most sophisticated, offensive chemical and biological warfare programs in history. And by offensive, you mean?
Well, limiting the black population, I would consider pretty offensive.
In her report, she says Dr. Basson's scientists created anthrax, cholera, botulinum, and a variety of other pathogens to kill or incapacitate rebel troops, anti-apartheid leaders, even ordinary citizens in the black townships.
They wanted to develop chemical and biological weapons to control the black population.
So basically, it was aimed at putting blacks out of action by one means or another.
That was one of the objectives, yes.
A recent book called Plague Wars detailed some of the methods they developed. Anthrax planted in the gum of envelopes, into the filters of cigarettes, inside chocolates, botulinum toxin hidden inside beer bottles, and salmonella germs hidden in sugar. Rarely can death have been prepared in such eclectic and obscene forms.
Do you really want me to comment on that?
Yes, I do.
Absolute rubbish. That was part of a legitimate, official, authorized research project, similar to research projects carried out all over the world. There was nothing special. There was nothing more sinister.
That is not what South African prosecutors said when they leveled charges of murder against Votabasson 3 years ago. Witness after witness spoke of assassination poisons developed under his command, of people tortured or murdered with chemicals and germs, and prosecutors here discovered a network of spies and scientists from around the world that Dr. Basson had assembled, among them Dr. Larry Ford of California. When did you first meet Dr. Larry Ford?
I cannot remember the exact date. It was somewhere in the middle 80s when he was introduced to me as a gynecologist with a special interest in microbiology. But along the way, it became clear that he confessed or professed to having certain knowledge in the field of chemical and biological warfare.
Apparently you had enough respect for him to invite him to talk to some of your scientists.
I found him to have a reasonably in-depth knowledge. At one stage, I arranged for him to meet our scientists.
And did he acquit himself as far as the scientists were concerned?
Well, the consensus afterwards was that he had some knowledge, but that he couldn't really contribute anything in great depth to our program as such.
If that's true, then why did Dr. Basson ask his Swiss money manager to set up that offshore account for Dr. Ford? That's a letter from...
Yes.
Yourself.
As far as I can remember, it had to do with monies that needed to be paid for his AIDS project that he was busy with in South Africa.
Why into a Swiss account?
I don't know. That was asked of me, and I did it.
But that AIDS project Dr. Basson mentioned was, in fact, a cover for biological warfare research. This AIDS document makes specific mention of Dr. Larry Ford, listing 2 routine medical tasks, and then, curiously, item 3, the acquisition of relevant chemical and biological weapons literature from Dr. Ford.
I'm not aware of that document. If you can show that to me.
This is the document.
Yep.
And it does talk, it's mainly about AIDS.
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden in the middle, as you can see...
It says here, the acquisition of any relevant CBW literature from Dr. Ford.
Yes.
Yes, I have no knowledge of this document.
You have no knowledge, but if the document is a legitimate document...
Nothing to do with Project Coast.
I mean, you've been so completely responsive. This is the first time that you have said, wait a minute.
Because that's not my document. How can I recognize it if it's not mine?
Fact is, that document is his. Not only was it found in Dr. Basson's possession when he was arrested, the South African prosecutor, Tory Pretorius, says it was put in evidence at the trial. In other words, conceivably, his AIDS work was a cover for his biological work?
Yes, that would be used as a vehicle and as a cover for other type of activities relating to the chemical biological warfare.
And Pretorius says it wasn't only the AIDS program Dr. Basson used as a front.
Mike, this was called Delta G. And
this now abandoned facility called Delta G, shown to us by an anti-apartheid activist, is where Dr. Ford supposedly worked on that hair regrowth formula. But Delta G was in fact Votabasson's chemical warfare plant, which made poisons meant to kill members of Nelson Mandela's African National Congress Party, the ANC. Dr. Ford worked with one of your project's labs, Delta G.
He discussed certain matters with scientists from the project lab.
He was working on a hair regrowth formula?
Larry had brought 2 or 3 formulas along that he wanted made.
Because we've been told, correct me if I am wrong, that work related to research on Silatrane, one of the poisons that Project Coast developed to kill ANC officials, was involved in the hair regrowth work.
No. First of all, let me correct you. Silatranes were not developed to kill ANC officials, any officials, or to kill anybody.
And he says Larry Ford never worked on Silatrane. But Delta G scientists testified that not only was Silatrane used as a poison, at a state hearing in Cape Town in 1998, they admitted to having created gadgets like trick umbrellas and these screwdrivers to inject the toxin. And halfway around the world, in Irvine, California, police told us the FBI had found one of those James Bond-type umbrellas in Dr. Ford's home. Project Coast developed one of those umbrellas to shoot out the Scylla train?
Yes. That project is a bit like the 007 books, where you get all this 007 type of gadgets.
Did you know that the FBI found one of those umbrellas in Dr. Ford's house?
No, that's totally amazing and new to me, yeah.
Did you know that one of these umbrellas was found in Dr. Ford's home?
I have no knowledge, and I would doubt that. In actual fact, I would say that that is impossible.
Really? Because the FBI says that they found one of those umbrellas in Dr. Ford's home.
Then you have different FBI sources than I do. I spoke to them last week, and there was no discussion.
Questioned them about an umbrella?
There was no discussion with me about any umbrella.
Well, of course, it's perfectly possible that your FBI guy...
I don't know who your FBI guy was. Mine's a senior FBI guy.
Voter Basson, notorious as Dr. Death. What would he be doing having regular discussions with senior people at the American FBI?
I don't know. That's surprising to me.
Do you think the American government knew about Voter Basson's program?
Well, I assume that the Americans knew that the South Africans were interested in biological warfare.
And here's proof. Detailed, handwritten notes that Dr. Basson kept on his meetings with U.S. military biowarfare scientists going back to 1981. Well, we spoke with some of the people that Basson met with back in the early 80s, and they said that they knew that Dr. Basson was developing a chemical and biological weapons program. And they briefed U.S. military intelligence after every meeting. So somebody in the U.S. intelligence establishment knew.
Well, Mike, I'm not sure who knew what, number one. But I'm also not sure that our intelligence agencies had a full picture of what was being developed by Project Coast.
Did you get any help from the Americans?
No, that I can't answer. I can't answer that question.
You can't answer that question. Dr. Basson also declined to discuss what he did after Project Coast was dismantled in the mid-90s. That is when he made the first of 5 trips to Libya. What was he doing in Libya?
I think to this day we'd like to know more about what he was doing in Libya. The U.S. government was very concerned about what he was doing, if he was selling secrets from Project Coast.
And why would he want to peddle secrets from Project Coast?
Well, for one thing, to make money.
Libya has money.
True.
Libya might want biological or chemical weapons.
I can understand America and Britain's concern.
The Americans were so concerned they issued both a diplomatic warning to Pretoria and reportedly a personal one to Dr. Basson. Basson said that the CIA threatened to kill him on one occasion.
Yes, one of the doctors working with him brought the message to him that the CIA said that he should stop visiting Libya.
On Dr. Basson's 5th trip home from Tripoli, he said the Israeli Mossad made the same threat. It was his last visit to Libya. But according to U.S. intelligence documents we've obtained, he was also reaching out to Iran and Iraq. How do you control a Voter Basson, a guy with all that knowledge?
Well, I think that's a very good question. One of the major concerns is that so much of the documentation that was thought to have been under lock and key was actually taken by Basson.
And how to weaponize them and willing to sell that expertise to the highest bidder. What do you understand was really the relationship between Ford and Basson?
I really don't know, but I think that that's one of the kinds of questions which, even if we never get an answer to, illustrates that in the future we're going to be facing some very different kinds of threats.
With weapons of mass destruction. Not nuclear, but chemical and biological.
Right.
Dr. Ford, of course, is dead. He committed suicide. As for Dr. Basson, his 2-year-long bench trial, not a jury trial, before a white apartheid-era judge ended this past spring the way that many South Africans, white and black, feared it would, when the judge declared him not guilty. Must have been a huge disappointment that he was acquitted, despite your best efforts.
Yes, true. That's true.
The prosecution is appealing the verdict. In the meantime, South Africa's Dr. Death is a free man, and he says he just wants to get on with his life. What you're saying is your conscience is absolutely clear. How do you persuade the skeptics?
I don't have to. It's no skin off my back. Judgment has been given.
You were acquitted?
Yes.
You were acquitted.
Today to decide whether the government may order public libraries to filter out pornographic websites to protect children from cyber smut. Opponents of such internet filters at the library